Hello, in this episode of Airs for Architecture, Dr. Dorina Pojani, Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Queensland's School of Architecture, Design and Planning, discusses her 2021 book, Trophy Cities, A Feminist Perspective on New Capitals, published by Edward Elgar Publishing. Dorina's research explores the interplay between mobility, transport and gender, and our discussion around Trophy Cities presents a small part of this thinking, particularly the concretisation of inequality and ways urban planning and design does, and more pertinently does not, enable equitable access to the everyday experience of modern cities.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm delighted to be talking today to scholar Dorina Pojani. Dorina, before you introduce yourself, we're going to be talking about your book, Trophy Cities, A Feminist Perspective on New Capitals, which you published with Elgar in 2021. Thank you ever so much for coming on. As we always do, would you be so kind as to tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself, please?
Of course. Thanks for having me. I am an urban planner. I started out as an architect, but then I realized that architecture was somewhat limiting. It was too small scale for me. I wanted to understand the broader picture. So I got more into planning. And within planning, I cover three areas. I'm still very interested in built environment issues. So I look at urban design, the aesthetics of the city. I look quite a lot at urban transport, but the sort of small scale transport, micromobility, walking, cycling, rather than the big transport, the large scale, the highways and the roads. And increasingly, I'm looking at housing as well because it's become such a big issue worldwide. I mean, so many places are experiencing one crisis after the other.
Fabulous. So where did you train in architecture? Did you do your undergraduate?
I trained in Albania. That's where I'm originally from. And then I went to the States for a while. I went back to my home country in Albania. Then I did a stint in the Netherlands, which is an excellent context to study urban planning, probably one of the best.
Yeah, one of the best.
And then and then I ended up in Australia. And I've been here 10 years now.
So what's urban planning? I mean, I think from the Western European perspective from which I speak, as you say, Holland is the place for urban planning, that alongside, I suppose, Denmark or somewhere like that. But what's it like in Australia? You're in Queensland.
I'm in Queensland, yes. Australia, well, it can be considered maybe a cross between the US and Europe. A friend of mine described Brisbane once as if London and Los Angeles had a baby. That's what she called it. I thought that was a very apt description because it does have the British flavor, the British origins. But then in the post-war period, the city went very American, very car-oriented, and we're still suffering the consequences. A lot of contemporary planning is about undoing the post-war period, really. And the car orientation, the suburbanization, the urban sprawl of that era.
Yeah, which sort of permeates almost every city now. I mean, I think I mentioned this quite a lot on the podcast. The area I live in southeast of England is suffering from this at the moment. Incredible sprawl, incredible densification, incredible reductive urban planning strategy, which is shifting everybody into motor cars. And I think this is pertinent to our conversation. I think it's, to a certain extent, pertinent to your book. So what inspired the book? Where did the book come from? Where did Trophy Cities derive from in your own thinking? Was it a sort of screamingly obvious critique? Yeah. What's its origin story?
Well, So some of it is personal experience. So
Hmm.
I grew up in Tirana, which is the
Hmm.
capital of Albania, and that's a new city. It's a new capital. It became capital in the 1920s, after Albania gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. Before then, it was just a large village, really. So I think it's been interesting to see the city grow and go through several transformations in the communist era and the post-communist period, which um, at first was characterized by crisis and now more stability and Western style development. And then, like I said before, I moved to the States, and the US also has a new capital. Washington City was one of the early master planned capitals. And then finally, Australia has Canberra. We have our very own master planned capital. And here in Australia, it's an interesting case because Canberra is this tiny place. It was almost born out of rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne. They couldn't decide which one of those two cities was going to become capital, so they settled on a third place, and that place never quite gelled. So now there is this almost sport among journalists based in Sydney or in Melbourne, Canberra bashing, they call it. When they want to highlight, urban failures, they start talking about Canberra. So those personal experiences shape my thinking to
Hmm.
some extent. But it's also the case that whenever I go to a city, I'm always interested in seeing the capital for some reason. I feel like it's in the capital that the nation represents itself. That's where you can see uh, which foot the nation wants to put forward, so to speak. So I feel like you can learn a lot from a place by looking at its capital, even though the capital is not always the fancier city. It's not always the financial capital. I mean, there are many countries where the financial capital is somewhere else entirely, places no capital. There are countries out there where tourists are more attracted to, I don't know, coastal cities, for example, that are not capital capital cities either. But I, as an urban planner, like to look at the capitals. Yeah.
Your issue around new capitals and this situating it within a feminist perspective, I guess I'm going to ask you a little bit about, to begin with, what is the substantive critique behind these new capitals? Obviously, they haven't had much time, most of them, to bed in, although DC probably has had a fairly large amount of time, Canberra likewise. And even Tirana, I suppose, has had, what, 100 years now. How would you describe them in general? I mean, what is if there is an overarching character, how would you describe them? And if not, how would you describe them, I suppose?
Well, a lot to unpack in that question. So I'll try and tackle the different the different parts of the question one by one. So, um, where does the feminist perspective come from?
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to clarify that my perspective is not just about the daily life in capital cities. That's a very valid feminist critique. A lot of academic planners and planning practitioners have been highlighting how modern cities don't work very well from female perspective. They don't meet women's needs in terms of housing, transport, childcare. Well, my critique, though, goes beyond the everyday. So the point of critiquing capital cities is to also look at the representation of the nation in urban form, which you don't see in ordinary cities. In ordinary cities, you see the daily workings, perhaps the economy. Does that meet the needs of women? Does the transport meet the needs of women, etc., but not the nation? And what I've noticed in capital cities, the ones that I've studied, but also others that I've visited but not studied in depth, is that a lot of times nations, contemporary nations, they view themselves as patriarchies, in the sense that there are hierarchical structures within government. There is usually a leader at the top. Most often, that leader is male. So that right there tells you that the patriarchy is at play. But even where the leader is female, the structures are still very patriarchal in the sense that they're hierarchical. So the state, the modern state, the way I see it, is organized in the same way that the patriarchal family is organized, where there is the father at the top, the mother is sort of underneath the father, has less authority, and the children that are younger have even less authority. And we've taken that structure and amplified, applied it to whole nations. And because of that structure, then we see certain designs that crop up over and over in new capital cities. We often see these very grandiose buildings or even urban spaces, parade malls, large grounds, etc. And to me, those are an expression of patriarchy in brick and stone.
That's an interesting idea. I can understand that. I guess we'll get round to what a feminist city might look like, and I'd be quite interested to look at that. But I was struck by this reference to the modern state that you made. Is this form of city particular to the modern epoch and modernizing states specifically? Or does it have a lineage that stretches back into, I suppose, more ancient and historic cities as well?
Well, that's a very good question. The patriarchy has accompanied human civilization all along. There aren't any cities out there that have been designed and built in a matriarchal context, right? So, in a sense, all cities that we see are patriarchal. Even, beautiful cities like Venice, that was created by the patriarchy. But I feel like in the modern era, and there are different definitions of the modern era, but for the purposes of the book, I said 20th century, 21st century. In the modern era, the patriarchy, I feel, combined with capitalism, commercial capitalism, to create this particularly imposing authoritarian version of urbanism. So the patriarchy was present in the past, but back then it was limited. So its manifestation in cities was limited by the financial means that people in charge had available. And a limitation was also posed by technology, of course. So you couldn't build very tall or very big or very wide because the technology wasn't there to travel across the city or to travel up and down a building. You couldn't do skyscrapers in the patriarchal regimes of the past. But now we can. So that's the urbanism we get. Capitalism and patriarchy, not a good combination. But I must say that a lot of failures are evident in cities that new capitals that were not created by capitalist regimes, even ones that were created under socialist or even communist regimes. I mean, we see the same sense of grandiosity, individual leaders with big egos trying to glorify themselves and the nation, or perhaps the stated purpose was to glorify the nation, but then indirectly they're also glorifying themselves.
So is this tied in a way to the rise of the idea of the nation state? Because I know this is one of the things that you touch on in chapter 2, this idea of nationalism and the way that capital cities become a means of describing or applying a national character to a people. And therefore, I guess what I'm trying to get to is do we see in quote unquote pre-modern societies something distinctly different? And I was thinking Venice, because I was thinking Venice is peculiarly, in a way, non-hierarchical as a series of space. It's got St. Mark's and it's got the little squares, but really these are incidental to the overall tenor of the place. But do we see the rise of the nation state as instrumental in this in this kind of form of city making.
Absolutely, yes. I think the rise of nations, which is a modern invention too. If we think about it, I mean, now we're all used to living in nation states, so it seems as if they've always been there. But I've reminded the readers in the book, I always remind my students as well, this is really a modern invention. It's a 19th century invention. Before that, I mean, there were empires, but they had semi-autonomous provinces in Europe. Through the Middle Ages, we had city-states, so relatively small places that didn't have these big resources to create such grandiose spaces. And then the nation state came along, and with the nation state came the need to represent the nation in physical space. So the idea was, well, twofold, or there are two ways to look at it. There was this effort on part of leaders and the designers that they hired to represent the nation, but then those representations were also meant to strengthen nationalism. So it was sort of a two-way process. And this need for the nations to gel was particularly important in some of the case studies that I've covered in the book. Places, for example, like Nigeria. Nigeria had no national identity, or very little national identity before independence from Britain. In fact, it was sort of a British invention. Colonizers arriving there and sort of putting together a variety of tribes that had very little to do with one another, and each of those was very large, was as large as a European country. Or we see nations like Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan had known no statehood before the Soviet Union. The first time Kazakhs experienced statehood was under Soviet rule. So that was an imposition. And so there was this effort to create this idea of an independent nation after the post-Soviet independence. And even here in Australia, I mean, it's the same thing. Canberra is the earliest case study that I cover. It was done in the early 20th century. And it was the idea of creating this new capital came soon after Australia gained independence from Britain again. So there was this desire to create a Southern Hemisphere identity that was not British, but was somehow Australian, not indigenous Australian as in Aboriginal, but local.
It's really interesting you talk about this. I haven't really thought about it, I guess, so much before, but the why of capital cities is an interesting one. And it's particularly interesting in the context of Britain, where we have this highly dominant single city that completely sort of deforms, in a way, the national narrative about itself. It is enormously dominant. With these modern capitals, with these new capital cities that have been made, are they very specifically designed to act as administrative cores for this new idea of the nation state? Is this their singular function? And then I suppose, and your example of Nigeria jumped out at me there because I've been tutoring a dissertation on the foundation of the Nigerian state and its problems. So I've been thinking about this quite a lot myself. Is the secondary function not only just about administration, but about securitization as well? That they become a manifestation of the security apparatus that defends the construction of the nation state?
Well, there's been a mix. I mean, the security issue was always present, or at least that was one of the stated goals in most of the capitals I created. And okay, in some cases, maybe the need for security was justified. For example, there is the case of South Korea. South Korea has a new administrative capital called Sejong. Not many people know it because it's still a relatively small
I
city.
I was amazed when I read this in your book because I thought because I'd lived in Seoul for a while, and I thought that that was still it. And when did this happen, by the way?
This happened, well, more than 10 years ago now that the administrative capital officially became Sejong. There is sort of a split role with Seoul still. But yeah, Seoul is very much like London, a city that in the past concentrated both administrative functions and financial function, the financial engine of South Korea. In the Korean case, I mean, you can see how they might have wanted to move the government functions away from the border from North Korea because there is always tension at the border. There is always the northern threat there. But in other cases, this need for security, or stated need for security, was, I'd say, pure fantasy on part of the leaders, the local leaders, was paranoia, almost bordering on paranoia. That's the case of Myanmar, for example, Burma. They moved their capital, Naypyidaw is their new capital to replace, which replaced Yangon. Yangon was a coastal city. Often colonial capitals are coastal because they were built for colonial purposes, moving materials that were extracted in the colonies, moving them easily to the metropole. So the Myanmar leaders, the Burmese leaders, they sort of pumped up this idea that, oh, we're under threat, the Americans will come and attack, etc. So we need to move the capital away from the coast. And there wasn't really much basis in all those fears, and certainly the threat wasn't so big that one needed to undertake such a huge expense, move the whole city to an inland location in the middle of the jungle. So that's for the security aspect. And as for the economy, it's a bit of a mixture there. So some of these new capitals have been created solely for the purpose of serving as serving administrative functions and have remained small. Canberra, for example, is still a relatively small city. I mean, here in Australia, we have mega cities. We have Sydney and Melbourne that are, I think they've surpassed 5 million people each, whereas Canberra is a tiny place by comparison. I mean, it's 500,000, about that. So it's still just government, and so that's one situation we encounter. But there have been cases where the nation has wanted the new capital to become sort of this big center of commerce that develops a whole region, brings people and business to a region that maybe was sort of neglected in the past, or too far from everything else, but they have not succeeded. That's the case of Brasilia. In Brazil, the new capital of Brazil, done in the mid-century after the war in the 50s. So that started with a lot of fanfare. The Brazilian people leaving the coast, the Portuguese colonizers had been too attached to the coast like crabs, clinging to the coast like crabs. That's they were talking about them. So there was this idea of sort of Wild West mentality. Let's conquer the interior. Let's conquer the savannah and bring development to the savannah. But the reality is Brasilia is still this half-baked, I want to call it, administrative capital, and the areas that have real life, real urban life, are outside of the pilot plan, which has been conserved, and it's now World Heritage, a UNESCO World Heritage site. So any financial vitality is in the areas outside. And I have a little anecdote to report here. So when I visited Brasilia to collect data for the book, to conduct my field work, I was in Rio first. And in Rio, I took a tour, so I could see the city quickly. Rio was not my case study, and the tour guide at the end asked me, "So what are you doing after? Are you going back to Australia?" I said, "No, I'm actually going to Brasilia." And she looked at me all surprised, and she said, "Why are you going to Brasilia? Are you an architect?" Because it's only people with a professional interest like me, or government people that are involved in government business that visit. Otherwise, there isn't much of an attraction to the place.
Have you ever been to Britain?
I have. I've been to London.
There's a town north of London called Milton Keynes, and
Oh yeah.
And it was in 1962, it was a town of about 100, a village of 150 people, and they turned it into what we call a new town. And now it's got 350,000 people in it. And it feels like a thing that's massively over distended. But it actually, yeah, it's like the bastard child of Leningrad and Las Vegas. And I think Brasilia for me, when I've seen images of it, because I've not visited, Brasilia for me is like the Milton Keynes of Latin America. It's like this terrible hybrid. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to get at is this idea of the nation state and its kind of securitizing mode of spatial production manifest in not just its relationship to the regions that it governs or oversees, but in the actual lived experience. Now, you talked about lived experience earlier in the conversation, or everyday experience, and I guess what I'm asking about is, does that character of new capitals permeate the everyday experience of people in these places? And if so, how is this delivered? Now, you've mentioned already certain spatial characteristics, big squares, boulevards, major buildings. I wondered if you could sort of unpack that a little bit, perhaps with some examples.
Yeah. Well, maybe I should talk about the everyday spaces as well. So the big spaces,
Yeah.
the parade grounds, those are meant for government, right? Display of government power, display of government financial ability, even, or
Sure, but they also deliver to the people who live in it the everyday experience of government power. If you know what I mean, it's like,
yes,
yes, like
absolutely.
you don't walk across a large parade ground without knowing that you're just a little guy and they're in charge.
Exactly. It's a way of telling the people that the government has the means to crash descent.
Yeah,
If we have a government that's capable of building these kind of spaces where tanks can potentially roll down, a
yeah,
street wide enough for a tank to roll down, they'll do it. They'll do it if
yeah,
needed. So you better know that and stay in your place. So
yeah.
that's what happens. And then the lived spaces, I mean, it's a mixed bag. One thing that a lot of these places have in common is the divide between rich and poor. And unfortunately, I mean, some of the cities that I covered in the book, like Chandigarh, for example, that's a regional capital in India, but it was very much a national endeavor because it was the first mega project created once India gained independence and once Pakistan and Bangladesh split. So that was created with the idea of being a socialist city. In fact, they brought in Le Corbusier to design it. Was very much influenced by Soviet ideals and syndicalism and, well, very, very progressive ideas generally, as an architect. But even Brasilia was the same. I mean, it was designed by this social reformer, President Kubitschenko, that they had back then that didn't stay in power very long, but he managed to create Brasilia during his short term. But even these places that were created with socialist ideals ended up very segregated. The wealthy ended up in the good housing, the designer-built housing, and the poor ended up in informal communities surrounding these cities. And now is those poor people in informal communities that provide service to the wealthier in the city proper. And in some cases, they have to endure some very long commutes to reach the city. That's the case in Abuja in Nigeria. That's the case in Brasilia, because the central cities of designer creations have been sort of protected, and they're not very accessible.
I remember seeing a series of maps about Tirana, to go back to your motherland, and the emergence of informality in and around Tirana in the, I guess, late 20s, probably I'm guessing from the 80s onwards. I can't remember the dating of the
90s, yeah,
maps. Maybe
90s after a fall of
90s. So it
communism.
was
Yeah.
from after the fall, was it? After
Mhm.
the fall of the wall. Okay. And I'm guessing that is also one of these characteristics of new capitals, is that you get this hyperproduction of forms of informality. Now, I'm not just talking about quote unquote slums or informal settlements, but laissez-faire planning, kind of incoherent, unplanned sprawl.
Absolutely, yes. So there is that first stage of very planned development. That's there is a
Hmm.
reason these places are called master plan capitals, right?
Hmm.
They are created based on master plans. But then once that initial stage is gone, often because they've happened in places with not very strong government capacity, then the new capitals end up surrounded by informal sprawl. That's happened in quite a few cases. Yes, yes, you're absolutely correct.
And with the master planning that you've mentioned, is there evidence? Did you come across evidence that there is a very specific idea at play that in, say, for Brasilia or I don't know, Abuja or whatever it is, when they're planning out their new capital, the architects and planners and policymakers, politicians, I suppose, do state very clearly, we want a city that's like this with this kind of space to demonstrate this kind of thing? Or is it a sort of embedded logic? Is it the patriarchy as a kind of
That simulated theory you're saying.
yeah, a subconscious kind of
Hmm.
driver?
I think that's what it is. I mean, I have not been able to read the design briefs that the government provided to the designers, partly because some of these places were created so long ago, and partly because it's just simply difficult to get access to that kind of document um, at this stage.
Yeah.
But I mean, I get the impression that I've asked myself the same question you asked.
Yeah.
Where do these models come from, and why uh, didn't these designers come up with any new models? I mean, they kept repeating
Mm.
for a whole century, as my case studies were spread all along the 20th century, and some even happened in the 21st century. And I kept wondering, why didn't designers come up with a new template? It seemed like everyone was stuck in the same mental template, create some um, major mall, line that up with government buildings. So oftentimes have these be disconnected from one another or from the people. And then once the master planning was done, just sprawl and informality. What's going on? And I think what you're hinting at is correct. There is this, I think the patriarchy has created these mental templates, and now we're unable to extricate ourselves from those. Which brings us to the feminist city, the idea of the feminist city and what that might look like.
Well, it does. I just wanted to get to one more point, which I was struck by in chapter 4, which was this idea of the religious and mythological significance
Oh,
of the
yes.
capital city, which I think is a really beautiful and fascinating idea. And you've mentioned kind of very secular states like Brasilia, and I suppose somewhere like Tirana, and a place like Canberra probably as well, where it's not an organic formation around cult, around religious
No, or traditional
foundation.
religions. No, no, it's not
No.
that.
So so
No,
what
no,
so
I
what
think
is the mythos that they're producing? What is this kind of this idea? What is the kernel, the seed here?
well, I think so. First, to provide some context for people that don't know these places, there are all manner of bizarre mythologies that surround these new capital cities.
Hmm.
So Brasilia in particular seems to be the epicenter of New Age cults. A lot of cults, I mean, literally, they set up shop around Brasilia. But then other places too, where you'd least expect. In Astana, for example, in Kazakhstan, there is this widespread belief that the Freemasons run the town. There is talk that particular designs, because they have certain shapes, very geometric shapes, like there is a pyramid there, or there is sort of triumphal arch, but sort of rectangular one. So according to a lot of people I talk to, it's like the Freemasons, they have their hands on the government, they've infiltrated and they've convinced the designer to do the space a certain way. And see that over and over. And I think this is a reflection of this need that people have to create some history and tradition in these spaces. And because there is no traditional religion, some of the places don't have a traditional religion to fall back on. So they've come up with this new conspiracy theories to replace that.
That's a really interesting idea that when you design a city on a tabula rasa kind of you find a swamp, you drain a swamp, you build a city, that you need in some way a foundational myth like Romulus and
Yeah.
Remus. You need
Yes.
some or Saint Mungo in Glasgow. You need this foundational myth.
Yes.
And
I
so
mean,
we start
Canberra. So Canberra, that was created by these two secular designers, a husband and wife couple from Chicago. Actually, they weren't even Australian.
Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Marnie Griffin.
So their plan, and but by the way, their plans were very beautiful. And at the time
Hmm.
when they were created, the wife did not get a whole lot of credits. She was very much in the shadow of her husband and his work. But she's been rediscovered in later decades as a designer, and now a lot of people say that, well, her beautiful designs with these sepia tones, they're saved in museums in Canberra. They were a big reason why this couple even got the commission for
Ah.
to create this new city. But anyway, so their plans have been analyzed and reanalyzed by conspiracy theories looking for symbolism. So the plan is interesting. There are these shapes, very, very geometrical shapes. There are these islands, and they're connected by causeways. There are some circles, parks shaped as circles. And to me, the way I see these spaces as a designer now, it's more parade grounds, sort of representative spaces for government. But people have analyzed them. They've even tried to correlate the Canberra plan with various constellations in the sky, and all these cosmic influencing all these cosmic influences in the plan for Canberra. And it's, I don't know, I find it very, very humorous. I mean, they've dug up the biography of the two designers to see what sort of spiritual religious influences they had back in their day, to try and provide some explanation why this plan was so geometrical and so spiritual,
Hmm.
all this meaning. And I don't think they set out to create that at all.
I wonder though, because I mean, I love a conspiracy theory, by the way. I think
Yes,
they're
I
inter
do.
I think they're interesting because they speak, I think, to, and this is somewhat off topic, I think they speak to the feeling that processes of modernization and modern constructions feel too light on the earth. They don't feel embedded enough in the way that human beings construct experience and knowledge, which is always deep rooted. And so these things about trying to find the cosmic like dynamism in a plan is a way of kind of, to me it would seem like a way of trying to embed the thing in the human experience, this cosmological human experience. That would be my more, I would like to think, slightly more generous. It's not that people are wanting to find wickedness, but that they're wanting to find a richness to it. But I suppose that's a little off topic.
What I think is happening is that because urbanization is still a relatively recent event, people haven't quite adjusted to it. I'm not talking about individuals, but societies overall. We're still very ambivalent about urban living. For the longest time, most people lived in rural areas in very close proximity to nature, green space, animals. Sometimes people literally lived with animals, farm animals, under the same roof, right? And now we're doing these things that are somewhat unnatural, living in these cities that have these very rigid geometries, and we live in much, much higher densities. We live in vertical buildings, so you're literally more disconnected from the earth. You're higher up, you
Hmm.
can be on the 20th floor, 50th floor, if you're in Dubai or places like that,
Hmm.
New York. And so people, yeah, they feel ambivalent. They don't quite know how to make sense of this new mode of
Hmm.
living. And conspiracy theories around urban plans are part of that. And we see this in these plans for old cities, but um, we see this in the recent conspiracies around the 15-minute city, for example, which is a very simple concept. Try to have facilities, amenities in proximity of people's homes. That's all that concept is about. That's all it says, 15-minute city. So everything is within a 15-minute walking distance from your home. That's all it is.
Mhm.
Yet all these conspiracies were created around that, like maybe urban planners, they wanted to put borders around the 15-minute neighborhood, and then you'd not be allowed to go from neighborhood to neighborhood, and you'd lose that freedom that you'd have as, a wild person living in the land.
I think this is really interesting. And I think to relate it back to your book, within the framework of a patriarchal neoliberalism, one must always question if that is the framework in which we exist. And I guess your argument would be that we continue to do so. Then the 15-minute city, which is, by the way, as far as I can see, just the Newtown movement.
Garden City, yeah, yeah.
It's a repackaging with green baubles, but I'm assuming that if the patriarchal neoliberal capitalist system is promoting these cities, it's because it's financially a good idea, and it will in fact only perpetuate that which it sort of rhetorically is challenging, because the tools of the master will never dismantle the master's house.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel the way we design cities under a neoliberal patriarchy now is let's optimize them for commerce and for
Hmm.
financial profit, corporate profit, and then worry about externalities, the way in which this style of urban planning harms the people. That's
Hmm.
practically how we do it. It's not as if we put people at the center and create a city that really works for people and then see how it can also work for finance. We do it the other way around.
Yeah, for sure. But it takes us on to this idea, this proposal you've got of what would a feminist capital city look like?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. It's a difficult question. A lot of people say, well, you have to have a counter proposal here. You've critiqued the patriarchal city,
Hmm.
but what's your counter proposal? And I feel like as an urban planner, I should not be the one to dictate a particular shape. In fact, that's been my critique, that shapes that have been imposed on people from above never worked. There is a lot of to critique there. So the feminist city should turn the idea of planning itself on its head. And instead of starting with a master plan a designer creates, um, even if it's a star designer, um, let's create a place that's been co-designed. The people and planners working together to figure out what shapes work best. I think that's our best bet for the future rather than
What do you mean by shapes? Do you mean like physical shapes, or do you
yes.
mean shapes of social forms?
Um, I guess both, but when I was speaking earlier, I was talking specifically about physical shapes. Yeah, I think those are problematic. The imposition of particular shapes on communities is problematic in itself.
And do you think that through a co-production or a co-design process in which the voices of hitherto marginalized people, which is probably women, certainly let's say women, ethnic minority people, disabled people,
Poor
children,
people.
poor people, old people. Well, poor old people, because rich old people get plenty of voice. Like, what do you imagine this would look like? What are the kinds of things? What does the evidence suggest the kinds of transformations in space might look like? And I know you say this is not your job, but do you mean, for example, narrower roads, shorter buildings, more green space, smaller green spaces, more spread throughout an urban area? I'm genuine question.
Yes.
Like, what do you
Yeah.
suggest?
Yeah, look, You know how in the 19th century this idea developed or became stronger that women are attached to home and hearth, whereas men are the ones that are supposed to go out there and work and
Hmm.
deal with production, right? Women would deal with reproduction. And a lot of contemporary feminists have tried to challenge that notion and say, oh, women should also go out and they should also be like modern men and, conquer urban space and travel all over, etc. And I say, well, if women have been traditionally associated with the smaller scale of home and family, um, I don't mean to say, let's put women back in the home, but as feminists,
Dorina, I don't think anybody's going to get that impression. You don't.
exactly, exactly. Anyone that has read my work
Yeah.
should not worry about me thinking that ever. But uh, you know, in a symbolic sense, why don't we, as societies, not women only, but as societies, why don't we own that approach and admit that small is beautiful? There is nothing wrong with small. There is nothing wrong with lower buildings. There is nothing wrong with narrow streets. And finally, there is nothing wrong with smaller cities even. We don't need to always go big and grand and parades and skyscrapers and thousand room palaces that
Mm,
um, both government authoritarians and major capitalists have created. So a
mm.
feminist city perhaps could embrace the idea of human scale. That's one principle right there. That will serve everybody, not just women.
But that would take, given what you've said about the sort of the way that capital cities are used to articulate a certain power dynamic within a governance system, it would take a total transformation of the self-perception of that governance systems, of the state itself, which is a lot to ask. And in the face of such a grand project, the full transformation of the way that government views itself in any given state, what can architects, what can planners, designers do on the immediate scale to organically produce it? Because one of the things I wonder about is that if we come in again with another grand scheme, even if it's a grand scheme for granular grassroots bottom up things, it's still a grand scheme, and at the level of power
Right.
dynamics it's still an application. So what can we do that gets past that?
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, look, I'm a child of revolution myself. I went through the major revolution, the communist, the capitalist revolution. That was a huge transformation. I'm not a big fan of revolutions, right? I think revolutions are not great for women. Women often end up losers in a revolutionary context. And sometimes they end up actively harmed. So we've seen that over and over. So I'm a much bigger fan of evolution, gradual transformation rather than breaking up with past structures immediately. I mean, I certainly believe we need to transform past structures. And in the book, I do have a critique of the nation state as such. It is a 19th century idea. After all, is that still valid in the 21st century, or should we give more power to cities themselves rather than the nation? So there is that, and I think we need gradually to transform those structures, but it shouldn't happen through war and violence, for sure.
Hmm.
It should happen through gradual changes working with communities.
So it's a transformation in the processes of production
Yeah.
rather than the outputs.
Yeah,
It's a
both.
vision for a
Both.
process of design.
Both. I see that we need to do both.
That's a big ask. Where do we start?
Of course, it's a big ask. Planning is a big profession. I mean, we have an open day every year at my university where parents come and ask students from the high schools. They come and ask what program is interesting and what the kids should be studying. And a lot of people don't know very much about planning. They know architecture, but they don't know what planning is. So they ask me. High schoolers and their parents, they ask me, so what is this profession about? What is planning like? And I say planning is about everything because cities are about everything. So you can have it be whatever you want it to be. You can focus, depending on your interest, you can focus on the environment, tackle that first, or focus on society, or focus on health. There are different ways to deal with the problem, and different people will look at different aspects of the city of the future.
Great. That's a wonderful point to finish on. Thank you very much, Dorina. Really lovely to speak with you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Somewhere out there on that horizon, out beyond the neon lights, I know there must be something better, but there's nowhere else in sight. It's survival in the city when you live from day to day. City streets don't have much pity when you're down. That's where you'll stay. In the city. Oh, in the city. I mean, I hate the Eagles, man, but that rings true. Thanks to Dorina for the approach, the conversation, and the patience with my interrogation. Thanks to Edward Elgar Publishing for the book. Please see the podcast description for a link to it, where you probably should buy it and share in its wisdom, and to Dorina's social and professional profiles. And thanks for listening.